If your team can't function without you, don't have a team, what you have is a bottleneck. And the longer you operate as the bottleneck, the harder it becomes to separate the two. Now, I've worked with operators running million-dollar businesses, and the single most common pattern I see across all of them is this. Business grows, but the leader doesn't keep pace in his or her growth. The business grows in terms of revenue, headcount, and even complexity, but the leader, remains in the same seat, making the same calls they were making when they had just 5 people. And when things start to stall or fail, the leader thinks that they have a people problem. But in reality, what they truly have is a structural problem. And I've seen it over and over, and that's why today, in this video, I'm going to show you the 5 leadership practices that will change this issue and help you create a true team. But before we get into it, I want to be clear about something, because this isn't a video about hiring better people. It's about creating more effective teams with the people you already have on the bus. So what I'm going to share with you comes from leading teams with over 300 people, from closing over 2,000 transactions, and from building businesses where eventually the team didn't need me in every room for the decision to get made. Now, that took time, and it took learning what most leadership advice conveniently skips over. So here's what nobody tells you early on. The skills that made you great as an operator are often the same exact skills that hold you back as a leader. You're good at solving problems, so your team brings you their problems, right? You're decisive, so your team waits for your decisions. You move fast, so your team moves at whatever speed you happen to be moving at that day. And none of that is their fault. It's the system you built, whether you meant to or not. So let's talk about how to rebuild it. To do so, I want to tell you about a client, Alex. Now, Alex runs a professional services firm, growing really fast, 7 figures. So on paper, everything looks okay, right? It looks right. But when I got on the phone with him, he described something I've heard so many times before. He said, I feel like I'm a prisoner to my own business. Now, he has about 12 people on his team, good people, really capable people, but nothing moved without him. Client escalations went to Alex. Pricing decisions went to him. Paperwork, proposals, hiring calls, questions about processes he had walked through, 5 times before. All of it still ended up on Alex's desk. And he was working 70-hour weeks, taking calls on vacation, checking messages at 11 at night. And here's what made the whole thing worse. His team wasn't incompetent. They were just waiting, right? Because waiting for Alex had quietly become the safest move in the organization and the learned behavior. Now think about it. If they made a call and Alex disagreed, there was friction, right? If they waited for Alex, the right answer came through him and nobody was in the wrong. So they just waited. And honestly, it made complete sense for them to do that. Alex's team was capable and hardworking, but Alex had built a system where dependent on him was the rational strategy. Now hold on to that, because we're going to come back to him in a second. So the first practice I want you to take on is about trust. And I want to push back on the most common belief around it. Most leaders think trust is built through a track record, through time, through the results they've done, stacking up over months and years. And while that can be part of the story, it isn't the most powerful part. True trust gets built by creating a culture and an environment of transparency. And I've sat in leadership meetings where 30 people are in the room, the leader floats an idea and everybody nods, right? And then the meeting wraps up. Then I'll pull one person aside afterwards and they'll tell me the idea was flawed from the very beginning, right? They weren't actually on board with the decision at all. And that's not an effective team running in the same direction. And that's not alignment. Here's the problem with that dynamic. Polite teams don't perform optimally. When the culture rewards agreement over honesty, you don't get your team's best thinking. You get the safest answer. So the shift is simple, but for those who been running a business for years, like what I just described, it's going to be a little uncomfortable. You have to model the behavior you want to see, and that means you have to say out loud in a meeting something like this, right? I'm not sure about this. What am I missing? You show your reasoning. You share your doubts. You invite real pushback instead of nudging everyone towards agreement. So when a leader is willing to be wrong in public, it gives the whole team permission to actually think out loud, and that's when meetings stop being theater and start being generally useful. And here's the thing, vulnerability isn't weakness in leadership. Pretending to have all the answers is. So by creating a culture where you invite the talented people you've hired to actually be part of the solution in a safe space, right, where they can voice and share their thoughts and opinions, that's how you build real trust. The second practice that I want to cover today is about conflict, and specifically learning to see it as a good thing. Strong teams debate, weak teams agree. I worked with a company where the leadership team had a stand-in Monday morning meeting, and decisions got made, they moved forward, and from the outside, it looked like a highly functioning group. But a few weeks in, a pattern started to show up. Decisions made on Monday were quietly being relitigated by Wednesday. The people were going around each other. Execution was fractured because half the room had never really bought in to begin with. The issue wasn't that people disagreed, it's that they weren't disagreeing in the right room and at the right time. So conflict is okay when done correctly and in a nurturing environment. So when disagreement gets pushed down in meetings, it doesn't go away. Frankly, it just shows up later in side conversations, in passive resistance and slow execution. And by the time you notice it, it's far more expensive to untangle. So the shift here is creating what I call productive tension. Explicit permission for people to challenge ideas before decisions get locked in, not after. So that means you have to be willing to sit in discomfort. You have to let a meeting get harder. before it gets resolved. And because a decision that gets stress tested in the room is worth far more than one that felt easy on the day and then subsequently falls apart. This is where most teams get it wrong. They opt for feeling comfortable in the meeting and pay for it way later. Okay, let me pause here for a second, because if any of this is hitting close to home, if you're listening and recognizing your own business and what I'm describing, then I want to offer you something practical. I created a growth constraint assessment. It's a self-assessment of where your business currently stands. It uncovers where the real friction is in your business in terms of like leadership, structure, process, etc. And you walk away with clarity on what to actually fix first. So if you want access to it, just comment growth below or check the link in the description. Let's keep going. The third practice is accountability. And the way most leaders approach it is completely backwards. Most leaders treat accountability like something they have to enforce personally. They check in, they follow up, they remind, they chase. They do this week in and week out. And after a long enough time, they just start feel less like a leader, more like a babysitter. Again, this is not a problem with people on the team. It's a systems problem. If you don't have a scoreboard, you don't have accountability. When I walk into businesses where the leader is constantly chasing performance, there's almost always one thing missing: KPIs, key performance indicators. Nobody knows the score in real time, not the leader and definitely not the team. But when you build simple, visible scorecards, weekly numbers, clear ownership, metrics that everyone can see, then things change. The accountability stops being about you and starts being about meeting the standard. People don't want to be the one dragging the numbers down. When the score is visible, the team holds itself accountable. So the shift is moving from leader-driven accountability to system-driven accountability. Your job isn't to catch people falling short. Your job is to design a system where falling short is immediately obvious to everyone, including the person who's falling short. That's a completely different role and is one that actually scales. The fourth practice is clarity, and I mean structural clarity, not clear communication. And specifically, I mean clarity on ownership. I've seen teams where two people thought they owned the same decision, both capable, both working hard, both operating completely inefficiently, and in many cases undoing each other's work without even realizing it. Because the question of who's responsible for what had never been answered explicitly. So clarity eliminates friction. It's really that straightforward, right? When roles overlap, energy gets wasted. People step on each other, things fall through the cracks, not because they don't care, because everyone assumes someone else had it covered. And here's what I want you to understand about your team. They don't want to fail. Right? I believe people naturally want to excel. They want to be excellent. So when I hear leaders say, man, my team is failing because my team is lazy, in most cases, I just don't think that's true. They're failing because the system created by the leader is failing. And in this instance, it's failing because they're busy doing the wrong things. So the shift is making sure every person on your team can answer 3 questions without hesitating. 1, what am I responsible for? 2, what does success actually look like in my role? And 3, what should I not be touching? If they can't answer all 3 of those questions, that's your work to do, right? Not theirs. A team with that kind of clarity operates differently. There's less checking in. There's less confusion around handoffs. There's less political navigation. Everyone knows the lane they're in and what moving fast inside that lane actually looks like. Finally, the 5th practice, and in my experience, the one with the most immediate impact, comes down to what you're measuring, right? Your team will always optimize for what you measure. Always. Now, I worked with a sales organization that was tracking all the right activity metrics, dials, emails sent, meetings booked. The numbers looked strong week over week and the team felt productive, but revenue wasn't moving. When we looked closer, the team had become very good at generating activity, right? They weren't gaming it. They genuinely believed that their dials meant more deals. Somewhere along the way, the behavior had disconnected from the actual outcome that they wanted. The team and the leader had lost sight of the fact that all this activity was supposed to lead to revenue. And it wasn't. So the fix wasn't working harder, it was changing what was on the scoreboard. When you measure activity, you're going to get activity. When you measure results, real results, revenue, sales, margin, customer outcomes, retention, your team starts asking completely different questions and getting different results. Not how many calls did I make, but what's actually producing outcomes and how do I do more of that activity. Now that's the difference between a managed team and an efficient, accountable one. One follows a process blindly, often a flawed process, and the other owns a result. Now remember Alex, I was talking about it earlier, about 12 months after we started working together, we were on a call, and what he described was absolutely unrecognizable from where we started. His team had weekly scorecards, every person knew their number and their role, honest disagreement was happening in meetings, it had become the norm, not chaotic, just real. They built simple criteria for when something needed to escalate to Alex versus when the team, could do it themselves. He took a 10-day trip, and surprise, surprise, the business continued to run in his absence. Not perfectly, because it's a process, but it ran. Decisions got made, clients got served, revenue came in, and most importantly, he told me it was the first time in 6 years he had been able to take a trip with his lovely wife and truly be in the moment with her and not be consumed with thoughts of the business. So that's what this actually looks like in practice, right? Not some dramatic overnight transformation. It's a series of structural changes that shift, the center of gravity from one person to the entire team. So in conclusion, here's what I want you to take away from all this. Your team is not the problem, right? Building trust through real transparency, creating space for honest conflict, replacing personal follow-up with systems, giving structural clarity and measuring outcomes instead of activity. None of that requires extraordinary people. What it requires is a leader who's willing to stop being the answer to everything and start building the architecture that makes the right answers possible without them. That's the work. And it's worth doing for sure. Now, if you want help figuring out where to start, the Growth Constraint Assessment is the right first step. It's free, it's specific, and it gives you a real picture of what's actually holding your business back. Again, the link is in the description, or you can just comment the word growth and I'll get it to you directly. Also, if this was useful, go ahead and like the video, share it with someone running the team who needs to hear this, and please subscribe if you want to hear more conversations like this one. I'm Guillermo Salas, and I'll see you in the next one.